Sun Wukong owned the Seoul skyline, but he didn't see the three silenced pistols waiting behind the elevator doors. He only saw the grease-stained brown bag in his hand. 10 words scrawled in frantic, bleeding ink would either save his life or lead him into a trap. "They're waiting in the elevator. Use the stairs." If you've ever had a gut feeling that saved your life, drop a yes in the comments. Like this video and subscribe to the channel to see how this power reversal unfolds. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell and be part of our community. The smell of rain-soaked asphalt and cheap engine oil was Ara Yoon's constant companion, a stark contrast to the sterile, pressurized air of the Dragon's Tower. In the heart of Seoul, the elite lived in the clouds, but Ara existed in the gaps between the neon lights, a ghost on a 125cc scooter. At 29, she had mastered the art of being a shadow. She delivered food to people who never looked at her face, through doors she wasn't meant to enter. It was a quiet, lonely life, but it was safe, or so she thought, until tonight. As she stepped into the marble lobby of the city's most exclusive penthouse, her hypervigilance, a relic of a traumatic childhood, screamed at her. She didn't look at the expensive art. She looked at the reflections in the polished brass. That was when she saw them. 3 men in suits that sat too tight across their shoulders, standing by the gold-plated elevators with the stillness of professional hunters. Upstairs sat Sun Wukong, the Ice King of the underworld. He thought his fortress was impenetrable. He didn't realize that his life now rested in the hands of the girl he'd never even bothered to tip. With a shaking hand, Ara pulled a marker from her pocket, choosing in one heartbeat to stop running from the shadows and finally step into one. The rain didn't just fall in Seoul, it claimed the city, turning the neon signage of Gangnam into blurred, bleeding streaks of pink and blue across the pavement. Ara leaned into the curve of the rain-slicked alley, her 125cc scooter humming a tired, mechanical rhythm beneath her. To the rest of the world, she was just another blue-clad ghost of the delivery economy, a cog in the machine that kept the wealthy fed without them ever having to open their curtains to the dark. She lived by a set of internal rules. Don't look them in the eye, don't linger at the door, and above all, never stop noticing the things that don't belong. Tonight, her destination was the Dragon's Tower, a monolith of glass and ego that pierced the low-hanging clouds. It was the kind of place where the air felt thinner, scrubbed clean by expensive filtration systems. As she pulled her bike onto the curb, the kickstand clicking into place, Ara felt the familiar weight of the thermal bag. Inside was an order of spicy tteokbokki and fried squid, a strangely humble meal for a man like Sun Wukong. She had delivered here 3 times before. She knew the sequence of the lobby lights and the bored tilt of the security guard's head, but as she pushed through the heavy glass doors, the atmosphere shifted. The lobby was cavernous, smelling of lilies and cold stone, yet the silence was wrong. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of luxury, it was the pressurized hush that precedes a storm. Ara slowed her pace, her boots squeaking softly on the polished marble. Standing near the bank of gold-leafed elevators were 3 men. They weren't residents. They wore charcoal suits that sat too heavy on their frames, hiding the bulk of something metallic tucked into their waistbands. While one mimicked the action of checking a watch, his eyes never left the floor indicator above the private lift. They had the predatory stillness of men who'd spent their lives in rooms where the lights were never turned on. Her skin prickled. It was the same electric hum she'd felt years ago, just before her world had been reduced to ash and sirens. These men were sharks in a fountain. Sun Wukong was on the 50th floor, likely expecting his dinner and a night of untouchable solitude. He was a man who moved the city like a chess piece, yet he was currently oblivious to the fact that the board was being flipped. Ara looked at the thermal bag, then back at the men. She could drop the food at the desk and disappear back into the rain. That was the safe choice. That was the invisible choice. But as the elevator chime echoed through the lobby, a cold mechanical heartbeat, Ara realized that some shadows are too heavy to ignore. Her father hadn't stayed silent, and as she reached for the marker in her pocket, she realized she couldn't either. The heavy thermal bag felt like an anchor, dragging Ara's conscience toward a choice she wasn't ready to make. She stood in the center of the lobby, the gold-leafed elevators a looming threat behind her. Every instinct screamed for her to pivot, to walk back through those glass doors and lose herself in the soul rain. If she left now, she would remain a ghost, untouchable, safe, and silent. But if she spoke, the veil of her anonymity would tear, and the shadows she had spent a decade fleeing would finally have a face to hunt. She looked at the men by the elevator. Their indifference was the most chilling part. They were waiting for a man's life to end as casually as one waits for a bus. Her mind flashed to her father, to the way his warnings had been dismissed as the ramblings of a man who knew too much. She couldn't let another man walk into a cage of silver and lead simply because it was more convenient to be a coward. Her fingers fumbled inside her jacket pocket, closing around a thick, permanent marker. The plastic was cold. With a sharp, sudden movement, she stepped toward a nearby marble pedestal, shielding the takeout bag with her body. The ink bled into the brown paper, the tip of the marker dragging against the grease-stained surface. "They're waiting in the elevator. Use the stairs." The words looked jagged, like a scream caught on paper. She folded the top of the bag over the message, hiding it from the predatory eyes behind her. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs as she approached the security desk. "Delivery for the penthouse," she said, her voice sounding thinner than usual, a fragile thread in the vast, echoing lobby. The guard barely looked up, gesturing toward the service phone. "He's coming down to the mezzanine. Leave it with the concierge or wait for the handoff." Moments later, the private elevator chimed. The three men tensed, their posture sharpening into a lethal focus. When the doors slid open, Sun Wukong stepped out. He looked exactly like the rumors described, a man made of sharp angles and expensive fabric, his neck tattoos peeking out from a crisp white collar. He moved with a terrifying grace, the Ice King in his natural habitat. Ara stepped forward before the men could move. Her hands were trembling so violently that the bag rattled. As Sun Wu reached for the food, his cold, dark eyes flicked to hers, filled with the disdain of a man who viewed her as a utility rather than a person. She didn't look away. Instead, she gripped the bag with both hands, pressing the ink-stained warning directly against his palm. She leaned in, her voice a ghost of a whisper that only he could hear. "Please," she breathed, her eyes darting toward the men standing in his blind spot. "Read the bag, now." Sun Wukong stared at the delivery girl for a heartbeat longer than necessary, his gaze a frozen lake of indifference. He was a man who lived in the center of storms, and he had long ago learned that everyone wanted something from him, mercy, money, or a moment of his time. He took the bag from her trembling fingers, the warmth of the tteokbokki seeping through the paper, and dismissed her with a sharp, curt nod. He didn't have time for the hysterics of a courier who had clearly spent too much time watching dramas. He turned his back on her, walking toward the private elevator bank with the effortless stride of a predator who believed he owned the jungle. As he stepped away, his thumb brushed against the side of the bag, catching on the rough texture of the fresh ink. He glanced down, his eyes narrowing as he took in the jagged, frantic script. "They're waiting in the elevator. Use the stairs." A cold, dry chuckle escaped his throat. It was a pathetic attempt, he thought. Perhaps she was a fan looking for a way to extend their interaction, or a rival's messenger trying to rattle his nerves with a schoolyard prank. He was Sun Wukong. He didn't take orders from people who smelled like exhaust fumes and rain. He reached the elevator doors and pressed the button, the gold-leafed panel glowing under his touch like a promise of return to his sanctuary. He stood there, waiting, his reflection caught in the polished brass. He looked impeccable, the Ice King in a white dress shirt, his loosened tie the only concession to the late hour. Behind him, he noticed the three men Era had seen. They were closing the distance, their movements synchronized and silent. Sunwoo's internal alarm, a silent hum that had kept him alive in the back alleys of Busan, began to vibrate. He glanced back at the note on the bag, the ink smudged where his thumb had pressed. Then the sound came. It wasn't the heavy, industrial groan of a standard lift. It was the high-pitched, mechanical ding of the private express car arriving, but it wasn't arriving at his floor. It was the sound of the car above him, the one he had just called, stopping prematurely. A floor above, then another chime, the floor below. The elevator indicator light didn't just move, it stuttered. Suddenly, the rhythmic electronic hum of the building's nervous system felt like a countdown. The three men in the lobby didn't look away anymore. They reached into their jackets, their eyes locking onto the back of his head with a terrifying, singular focus. The prank suddenly felt like a prophecy. For the first time in a decade, the Ice King felt a drop of cold sweat slide down his spine. The note wasn't a joke, it was a lifeline, and the stairs were 20 feet away, a distance that suddenly felt like a mile. The mechanical heartbeat of the elevator grew louder, a heavy, metallic grinding that signaled the car was seconds from arrival. Sunwoo stood frozen, his hand hovering near the brass call button, caught in the vacuum between arrogance and survival. He was the Ice King, a man whose very name silenced rooms, yet in the dim light of the lobby, he looked suddenly brittle, a target painted in expensive silk. Era hadn't run. She was halfway to the glass exit when the change in the air, that familiar, sharp ozone of impending violence, anchored her feet to the floor. She turned, her eyes scanning the three men. They were no longer pretending. One had his hand inside his charcoal blazer, another was moving to flank the elevator bank. They were closing the trap. She didn't think she moved. Her sneakers squeaked against the marble, a desperate, frantic sound that shattered the lobby's oppressive silence. Sunwoo turned, his expression darkening into a snarl of confusion as the delivery girl he had just dismissed came charging back toward him. He opened his mouth to bark a command, to put her back in her place, but the words died in his throat. Era didn't stop. She collided with him, her smaller frame hitting his muscular build with the force of a panic-stricken bird. Her hand shot out, her fingers digging into the fine fabric of his white dress shirt, her knuckles brushing the warm, tattooed skin of his forearm. It was an act of total sacrilege. No one touched Sun Wukong without permission, let alone a girl who smelled of rain and spicy oil. "Move," she hissed, her voice vibrating with a primal authority that bypassed his pride. He stiffened, his muscles coiling like a spring, his first instinct to throw her off, but then he looked into her eyes. They weren't the eyes of a fan or a hitman, they were wide, dark, and filled with a terrifyingly familiar clarity. She was looking past him, at the shadow of the men reflected in the gold paneling behind him. The elevator gave a final, resonant ding. The doors began to slide open, revealing nothing but a void of darkness and the glint of steel. In that split second, the power shifted. The Mafia boss, paralyzed by the shock of his own vulnerability, felt the delivery girl's grip tighten on his arm. She didn't just point, she yanked him toward the heavy steel fire door tucked into the corner of the hallway. "The stairs," she breathed, her voice a jagged edge of iron. "Unless you want to die in a suit that costs more than my life." The sheer audacity of her touch, the heat of her hand against his skin, broke his trance. As the first suppressed thud of a bullet splintered the marble where he had stood a second before, Sunwoo let the girl lead him into the dark. The heavy fire door slammed shut, cutting off the opulent glow of the lobby and swallowing them into a world of raw concrete and flickering fluorescent hums. The transition was jarring, from the scent of lilies and marble to the stale, metallic chill of the emergency stairwell. Sunwoo's lungs burned, not from the physical exertion, but from the adrenaline-fueled realization that the sanctuary of his own tower had been compromised. Above them, the stairwell spiraled upward into infinity. Below, it dropped into the bowels of the city. "Down," Ara whispered, her voice tight but remarkably steady. She didn't let go of his sleeve. Her grip was the only thing anchoring him to the reality that he was being hunted in his own home. Behind the steel door, the muffled thud-thud-thud of silenced rounds hitting the frame echoed like a heartbeat. The hitmen weren't shouting. There were no Hollywood theatrics, just the terrifying, rhythmic scuff of tactical boots and the clicking of radio comms. They had initiated Shadow Protocol. They weren't just here to kill him, they were here to erase him. Sun Wu's hand went instinctively to his waistband, but he was empty-handed. He had walked down to dinner thinking he was the apex predator. He looked at Ara, her face pale under the sickly yellow light, her low ponytail disheveled. She was a delivery girl who should have been halfway home by now, yet she was moving through the shadows with a calculated precision that defied her uniform. "Why are we going down?" he demanded, his voice a low growl of returning authority. "My security team is on the 48th floor." "If they were your security team, the elevator wouldn't have been a trap," she retorted, not looking back. "They're already on the 48th. We go to the garage. My bike is in the service bay." The sound of the fire door groaning open above them sent a jolt of ice through Sun Wu's veins. The hunters were in the labyrinth now. The game had shifted from a hit to a harvest. Every step they took on the concrete stairs sounded like a gunshot in the silence, the metallic clatter of the railings vibrating under their touch. Ara led him past the 4th-floor landing, her eyes darting to the floor numbers. She wasn't just running, she was measuring the distance between their lives and the darkness. In the distance, the faint mechanical whine of a drone began to echo through the shaft, a high-tech hound scenting its prey. The Ice King looked at the girl leading him through the guts of the building and realized for the first time that his life wasn't held together by his millions or his ink, but by the grit of a stranger who knew the shadows better than he ever would. They weren't just in a stairwell, they were in a tomb, and the only way out was to become faster than the ghosts chasing them. The air in the sub-basement was thick with the scent of damp concrete and the rhythmic, industrial thrum of the building's massive cooling fans. It was a dead zone, a cavernous space filled with heavy shadows and the skeletal frames of dormant machinery. Ara finally released Sun Wu's sleeve, her chest heaving as she leaned against a rusted steel pillar. The silence here felt heavy, a temporary reprieve from the mechanical death sentence echoing in the stairwell above. Sun Wu didn't lean. He stood in the center of the dim light, his white shirt stained with grease and sweat, his eyes 2 shards of flint. The vulnerability he had shown in the lobby was gone, replaced by the dangerous, calculating intensity that had built his empire. He stepped toward her, his shadow stretching long and menacing across the floor. "Enough," he rasped, the word vibrating with the authority of a man who was used to breaking people. "No one survives a professional hit by accident. You didn't just see suits in a lobby. You read their positioning. You timed the elevator chime. You knew the Shadow Protocol before I even felt the wind change." Ara didn't look up, her hands still trembling as she wiped a smudge of engine oil from her forehead. "I'm just a delivery girl, Mr. Kang. I have orders to finish."
"Liar," Sun Wu growled, closing the distance until he was inches from her. He reached out, not with violence, but with a terrifying precision, grabbing her chin and forcing her to meet his gaze. "A delivery girl runs for the exit. She doesn't dive into the fire to drag out a man she's never met. You didn't learn to move like that in a training manual. You know the language of the streets, the kind spoken in the back alleys of Busan and the dark corners of Seoul. You know how to disappear because you've done it before." His eyes searched hers, looking for the crack in her armor. "Who are you, and why is a ghost delivering my dinner?" Ara felt the heat of his hand against her skin, a physical reminder of the world she had tried to bury. For a moment, the roar of the cooling fans sounded like the crackle of the fire that had taken her father. She pulled her chin away, her voice dropping into a low, jagged register that matched the darkness of the basement. "I'm the person who knows that those men didn't come from your rivals, Mr. Kang," she said, her eyes narrowing with a sudden, sharp clarity. "They used the service key, the one only your inner circle carries. If you want to know who I am, first you have to survive long enough to realize who they are. Now, follow me or stay here and wait for the men you call brothers to find you." The vibration of the cooling fans seemed to sync with the frantic thrumming in Sun Wu's chest. He stared at Ara, his hand still hovering near the space where he had just held her chin, his mind racing through a gallery of faces from his rise to power. Her words hadn't just been a warning, they were a confession of a shared history he hadn't realized they possessed. The service key, Sunwoo repeated, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. Only the elders and my personal lieutenants have access to the service override. You're telling me my own family is trying to bury me? It's what they do, isn't it? Ara replied, her voice gaining a bitter edge. She stepped further into the shadows of the cooling unit, the blue light of a nearby control panel washing over her face. They find the man with the most vision, and they treat him like a traitor. They did it 10 years ago to a man named Yoon Dae-jung. Does that name ring a bell, or was he just another body on the way to your throne? Sunwoo stiffened. The name hit like a ghost's touch. Yoon Dae-jung. He had been the lead informant for the anti-corruption task force, a man who had nearly dismantled the syndicate's predecessor before a warehouse fire had silenced him and his entire family. Sunwoo's mentor, the man who had taught him everything about loyalty, had been the one to order the strike. Sunwoo was a young enforcer then, standing guard outside that very warehouse, watching the smoke rise and believing he was protecting his heritage. He wasn't a traitor, Ara said, her eyes burning with a decade's worth of suppressed rage. He was a father. He was my father. Your family didn't just kill a snitch, they burned down a world. And now they're doing the same to you because you're starting to look too much like him, too much like a man who wants to clean up the mess they thrive in. The air between them changed. The threat from the stairwell felt distant, replaced by a heavy, suffocating tension that bound the Mafia boss and the delivery girl together. Sunwoo looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the girl who survived the fire he had helped guard. The irony was a jagged blade. The daughter of the man his people destroyed was now the only thing standing between him and his own brother's knives. I didn't know, Sunwoo whispered, the Ice King's mask finally cracking. You were told what made you easier to control, Ara snapped, though her voice wavered. But right now, the snakes are in your penthouse, and the fire is coming for you. I didn't save you for your money, Sunwoo. I saved you because I won't let them win twice. High above, the heavy boom of the basement door being kicked open echoed through the concrete chamber. The conversation was over. The past had been revealed, but the future was currently aiming a red laser dot through the dark. The heavy thud of the basement door echoed like a gavel, and for a split second, the air between them was pulled taut by a decade of shared ghosts. But Ara didn't let the weight of the past paralyze her. She grabbed Sunwoo's hand, no longer just a customer or a target, but a man tied to her by blood and fire, and pulled him toward the service bay. We don't have time for your regrets, she hissed, as they ducked behind a row of industrial dumpsters. Move! The service bay was a cavern of shadows, smelling of exhaust and stale rain. Her 125cc scooter sat under a flickering security light, looking impossibly small and fragile against the armored SUVs that usually flanked Sunwoo's life. Above them, the hunters were descending, their tactical lights slicing through the dark like scalpels. On, she commanded, kicking the engine to life. The motor coughed, then settled into a defiant, high-pitched thrum. Sunwoo hesitated, his gaze sweeping the exits. They've blocked the main gates. My own men are at the perimeter. We're cornered. They've blocked the gates for cars, Ara countered, her eyes flashing with a sharp, kinetic energy. They don't see the city the way I do. They see targets. I see gaps. Sunwoo climbed onto the back of the small bike, his large frame making the suspension groan. He gripped the rear rack, but as Ara twisted the throttle, the jerk of the machine forced him to wrap his arms around her waist. It was a jarring reversal of his world, the Mafia boss clinging to a delivery girl as they plunged into the dark. She didn't take the road. She dived into the narrow service gap between the Dragon's Tower and the adjacent warehouse, the handlebars clearing the brick walls by mere inches. Behind them, the roar of a high-performance engine signaled that the hitmen had reached their vehicles. "Hold on," Ara shouted over the wind. She navigated the city like a surgeon, weaving through the blind veins of Seoul, alleys too narrow for SUVs, stair-stepped paths designed for pedestrians, and the rain-slicked shortcuts of the delivery underground. She knew every loose cobblestone and every low-hanging wire. Behind them, the headlights of their pursuers grew distant, trapped by the very urban sprawl Sunwoo thought he controlled. As they burst out onto a bridge overlooking the Han River, the neon lights finally caught them, but the perimeter was broken. They were no longer trapped in the tower. They were ghosts in the machine. Sunwoo looked at the back of Ara's head, at the determination in her posture, and realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't leading the charge. He was being saved by the daughter of a man he had helped erase, and she was the only one who knew the way home. The neon glow of the city blurred into a streak of electric violet as Ara pulled the scooter into a hidden maintenance yard behind one of Sunwoo's secondary holdings. The engine sputtered and died, leaving a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. Sunwoo dismounted, his legs unsteady, his expensive dress shirt torn and smeared with the grime of the city's underbelly. He looked at his hands, the hands of a man who had ordered deaths from a leather chair, and realized they were shaking. He wasn't the Ice King anymore. That man had died in the elevator trap. "I need a phone," he rasped, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. It lacked the jagged edge of a threat. It sounded like a request. Ara didn't hesitate. She handed him a burner phone she kept in her delivery kit. "Make it quick. The sun is coming up, and shadows don't last in the light." Sunwoo made 3 calls. He didn't call his lieutenants or his brothers. He called the ghosts, the men his mentor had cast aside for being too honest, the ones who still remembered the name Yoon Dae-jung. He spoke with a quiet, terrifying clarity, not of power, but of debt. He told them the truth. The syndicate was a rot that was finally consuming itself. When his loyalists arrived an hour later, they didn't find a boss demanding fealty. They found a man standing next to a delivery girl, looking at the city skyline as if seeing it for the first time. The cleaning was swift, but surgical. Sunwoo didn't use the flashy violence of his youth. He used the information Ara's father had died to protect, the digital trail of the service keys, the bank records of the traders, the evidence of the very corruption he had once ignored. One by one, the elders were removed, not by bullets in back alleys, but by the weight of their own sins. Sunwoo watched from the monitors as the men who had tried to kill him were led away in zip ties. He realized then that the elevator, the fast, easy way to the top, was always a gamble. It was a confined space where you were at the mercy of the machine. "The stairs are harder," he murmured, looking at Ara, who was leaning against her bike, watching the sunrise over the Han River. "You have to feel every step. You have to gain height." He turned back to his desk, but he didn't sit in the high-backed leather chair. He stood by the window, the Ice King replaced by a man who finally understood that his empire was built on a foundation of ash. He had reached the top again, but this time he had taken the long way up, and he had done it with the daughter of the man he had helped destroy. The house was clean, but the air still smelled of rain. The golden hour of a Seoul autumn settled over the city, turning the Han River into a ribbon of molten copper. Ara stood on the terrace of a quiet, unassuming cafe, not a skyscraper or a fortress, but a place where the air felt honest. She no longer wore the blue polyester of the delivery service. Instead, she wore a simple linen coat, her hair down, the hyper-vigilance in her eyes replaced by a calm, steady alertness. The sound of footsteps approached, but they weren't the heavy, synchronized thuds of a security detail. They were solitary and deliberate. Sunwoo King stepped into the light, his neck tattoos partially hidden by a soft sweater, his face devoid of the Ice King mask that had once been his only skin. He didn't look like a man who owned the skyline. He looked like a man who had finally learned how to walk on the ground. He placed a small, wrapped box on the table, not a bribe or a debt payment, but a gift between equals. "I still take the stairs," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Every morning, it reminds me of the weight of the climb. Ara nodded, looking out at the city that had once tried to swallow them both. And I still watch the elevators, she replied softly, but now I watch them for the people who are lost, not just the ones who are dangerous. In the quiet space between them, the true value of their journey hung in the air like wood smoke. Their story served as a living testament that status is nothing more than a fragile illusion. In that frantic midnight run, the lowly delivery girl had held more life and death power than the man with millions in the bank. It was a lesson in the quiet strength of situational awareness and the rare moral courage required to save even a monster simply because it is the right thing to do. They were proof that our greatest allies and our own salvation are often found in the very people we choose not to see. Sun Wu looked at Ara, recognizing in her the legacy of a man he had once helped destroy, now transformed into the foundation of a man he was trying to become. The war was over, the debt was acknowledged, and the menu had changed. They weren't just surviving the shadows anymore. They were finally learning how to live in the light. What would you do if you held the life of a powerful man in your hands? Would you save him or let the doors open? Tell us your choice in the comments and share this with someone who loves a good underdog story. Thank you for listening. See you in the next one.